So, hey everybody, Jeff Posnick, a member of Google's Web Developer Relations team. And today we're going to talk about something that I've spent some time working on. It's a project called Polymer. Folks heard about Polymer before? Are you here because you've used it? Or some? Okay, so this is going to give a bit of an introduction to what Polymer is all about, walk through building some web components using Polymer, and for folks who have used older versions of Polymer, talk about some of what's new in kind of like the Polymer 1.0 release, which happened about a year ago. So cool. So before we talk about Polymer, let's spend some time talking about something else that's very directly related, and that's web components. And so in the past, you kind of have a situation where there'd be a new HTML tag that somebody would propose or got invented, and then we had to wait for it to ship in every browser before we could use it. And we're no longer relying on standard bodies to tell us what HTML has to look like, thanks to web components. So if we want to use a new tag, we invent it, we write some code for it, and then we can share it with everyone. And so the web components APIs are very flexible and they're very powerful. So there are 4 specifications that make up web components. Template and Shadow DOM in particular are kind of like the hardest to polyfill, and they are really what's necessary to enable true interoperability across all browsers. And fortunately, browser vendors are kind of collaborating actively, more actively by the day, it seems, and have been making a ton of progress towards shipping them pretty widely. So, web standards work can be pretty delicate, and I don't want to put words into the mouths of the other browser vendors. I obviously speak from a Chrome perspective. So let's just show a couple of direct quotes. And this is Wilson Page from Mozilla, published the State of Web Components post that ends with this quote. I'll give folks a chance to look at that. We'll share these slides afterwards also, a lot of text to get through. So Microsoft has also been working hard on web components as part of Edge. Here's a representative quote from Microsoft about template element support and a few other things. And the WebKit team have been making considerable progress lately. They sent out this tweet back in September, and since then they've been doing a lot of work around Shadow DOM in particular, getting that natively implemented, which is great. So yeah, we're making tons of progress, which is great, but there's more to the story of web components than just new standards. So because the web components APIs that I talked about on that earlier slide are very low level, they're designed with the idea that we can and should build libraries on top of them. So when somebody asks, what is Polymer? The answer is, Polymer is a library to help you build web components. And its job is to make it easier for you to work with the low-level APIs, things like templates and the Shadow DOM and HTML imports, and to also provide polyfills, really performant, technically complete polyfills that you could use so that web components will work across all major browsers. So that's the goal of Polymer. Polymer is not a framework. Based on what it described as the goal, that's not what a framework does. Polymer is a library for building web components. Despite what was in the conference schedule for today. So sorry if folks came here expecting a framework talk. So a point that we're trying to stress that the premise of web components is that they are not a framework. And the goal is to make it easier for you to build web components that you could use anywhere. So you could write something in Polymer and you could use it in an Ember app or a React app, or build your entire app using components without a framework if you want to, just using vanilla JavaScript to kind of stitch together the web components. It's up to you, and things that you build with Polymer really are agnostic, just like DOM elements are agnostic. So in the world today, kind of frameworks sit directly on top of the web platform. And we want to get to a place where the building blocks of your app can be web components if you choose. So those web components may be built using Polymer or the polyfills provided by Polymer. And we do think that it makes it easier to build web components if you are using Polymer. But you could also do it in vanilla JavaScript. And you could still use whatever framework you're most comfortable with to kind of orchestrate the web components and have them work together and talk to each other and pass data back and forth. And you could pick and choose. So another thing that a lot of people ask about Polymer, is it ready for production? Polymer has been floating around as an idea and as a library that was kind of shipping in a developer preview release for several years now. And we had a 0.x branch that people might have used in the past. And over the past year or so, we've been doing a ton of work so that we could make people feel confident putting Polymer into production. And right now, there's been an exponential growth of Polymer adoption on the public web. So we have, by our metrics, 1.3 million public-facing pages are using Polymer. That's a somewhat old stat. It's probably higher by now. And we have the Polymer Starter Kit, which I'll be talking about a little bit later. It's been downloaded over 65,000 times so far. And we've been seeing some major companies buy into the model of using reusable web components. Here's another quote. Digest at your leisure from ING Direct's head of IT strategy about their plans. But more importantly, a lot of people have asked, okay, so what Google web projects are using Polymer? And Polymer 1.0's internal web adoption has been pretty spectacular as well. So we have over 300 Google projects that are using Polymer in some form or another, including some that I'm sure you guys have used. And we launched 1.0 less than a year ago. And it takes time to build and ship something, but you can see how many are coming in the pipeline as well. So to highlight a few that have launched so far, Google Play Music relaunched their web interface, and it's built using Polymer 1.0. And it's a really nice way to take advantage of all the material design animations and general material design spec by using the packaged elements that we provide as part of Polymer. And I'll talk a little bit more later about where you can find those elements and how you can use them in your own app. YouTube Gaming is now built in Polymer as well. So we launched a kind of brand new gaming-specific portal into YouTube, and it was written from the ground up in Polymer. And that's all I could kind of talk about right now, but we know that you're going to see a few more in the coming months. So at this point, we're definitely confident in saying that Polymer 1.0 and the web components polyfills are ready for production use, whether you're internal at Google or in your own web applications. All right, so that's kind of what Polymer is. That's the state of the state of the ecosystem. And let's see what it actually looks like if you were to build your own reusable web component using Polymer. So there are kind of two main ways that people might interact with Polymer. You might build your own components, or you might use one of the prepackaged components that either Google or many third parties have written and published. And using them in your own web application will feel very similar, whether it's something you write yourself or something you use that a third party has written. But let's say that you do want to package up some logic that you have and ship it as part of a component that you write yourself. All right, so this is the element we'll build, a little banner across the top letting people know that awesome things have happened. And you could imagine that being something that many web applications would want. You don't want to write a brand new banner code for every single web application you deploy. Why not write something reusable? So let's do that. We're going to call it alert banner. This is something that you'll see whenever you're dealing with web components in general. It's not Polymer specific, but you have to come up with a DOM tag name that has a hyphen in it. And this is just to distinguish it from the native DOM elements. So kind of sometimes have to get creative with coming up with hyphenated names, but alert banner works pretty well for this case. And this is a pretty simple component, but we've chosen it because it kind of highlights a few different features of Polymer without getting too crazy, getting too deep into kind of like the data binding side of things. So let's kind of walk through the different steps to build it. We're going to show some HTML on the screen, and this is all going to assume that it's packaged into an alert-banner.html file. This is kind of like the distributable for your web component. Everything can be put into one single HTML file, or you can break things out if you want to. If you want to get a little crazy with tooling and stitch things together, or have external JavaScript and run it through transpilers and things like that, you can do that with Polymer. I'm not going to talk about that today, though. So, all right. So this is going to be treated as an HTML import. This is something that one of the web component specs is for HTML imports as a way of pulling in these HTML files into your own web page and using them. So that's how you're going to be consuming this element. So this is kind of boilerplate so far. A DOM module tag with an ID is how you define the new tag that you're going to have. And we have the ID alert banner, and we have a script tag over there with some JavaScript where you're using the Polymer constructor and saying that it's an alert banner. So let's dig in a little bit past the boilerplate. All right, so at the very top of our file, this is your chance to use the HTML import API to actually pull in any dependencies that your own module has. And in this particular case, all that our custom element is going to depend on is kind of this core Polymer definition over here. And if you're using an element that composes a bunch of other elements together, or if you need to pull in third-party JavaScript or something like that, you could do it all using additional link tags at the top. But here we don't have too many other dependencies besides the Polymer framework itself, and that's what lets us do Polymer. When I say framework here, I mean the things that give us the Polymer constructor right over there and let us use kind of like all the syntactic sugar. Yeah, and this will make sure that the assets that I need are loaded. It'll make sure they're only loaded once. Even if you have multiple elements, pretty much all of them are going to depend on that same Polymer definition, but you don't have to worry. The browser will know how to make sure it doesn't download the same thing 10 times. So we're just importing that in there. And next I have that DOM module tag. So this is a special element that Polymer, in Polymer, that gives you a place to specify your own element's template and the JavaScript prototype. So that template is another part of the web component specifications. And you'll notice that there, we'll get into a little bit more detail. And you'll notice that ID tag has to match up with what you use within your JavaScript. And this allows you to do things like take your JavaScript, move it into an external file, concatenate things, and Polymer will know to match up that ID with that Polymer is definition over there. So you do need to make sure that those two things match. Okay. So inside that template, you have the ability to specify what the local DOM for your web component will be. And this is DOM that is specific to your own custom element. And you manage it as part of the element. You have control over what gets inserted in there, how it's displayed, and how it's styled, and things like that. And it really gives you a level of encapsulation. That means you don't have to worry too much about what else is going on in kind of like the parent container app. And that certainly helps make your elements more reusable if you don't have to worry about things like, is this being loaded as part of a list, or is it being loaded as part of this type of view or that type of view? You just focus on the DOM that you want to control. All right. So we'll put some markup inside of that template tag for the banner. And whenever somebody actually uses an instance of our alert banner, whatever's inside that template will get kind of stamped into the page's DOM. So that template is effectively inert initially. You won't have to worry about any placeholder stuff being displayed until you explicitly add a tag. And you can add multiple tags, and you'll have multiple copies of the template's contents that will get stamped into your page. So you could put style tags in as well, as I mentioned, and these styles are all scoped to your specific web component. So you don't have to worry about having a really generic style class name that ends up overwriting or being overridden by the other alert class that's in your page, or the other message class that's on your page, or whatnot. So you get a nice set of encapsulation by relying on the local DOM. And yeah, that's kind of what it would look like over there. And that all is just kind of CSS, HTML. I haven't really gotten into any JavaScript yet. We get a little bit of JavaScript boilerplate over here for the Polymer elements, kind of using the constructor and defining the prototype. And we're not going to do too much else right there yet, but we'll get into that a little bit more. So this is how you would actually, once you have your alert banner, that HTML defined, and you then, on the page that's using it, you would put in your own HTML import using a link tag. And after that's been imported, you can then start using alert banner on the page, just like any other HTML tag. You put that on, and you see what we defined over there. So what we defined over there, pretty static right now. We got some hard-coded text inside a div, and that's great. Presumably, you would like to be able to extend that a little bit, instead of just saying that, hey, user, something awesome happened. And there are a few different ways you can make your own Polymer elements consume data that kind of configures it or changes the behavior. So we're going to talk now about how you could use how you could basically pass things into the local DOM using a content element. And that's right over here. So this content tag is a special way of saying, I would like to pull in things that are passed from, and in particular the DOM, that is passed in from the page that holds my Polymer element. And I would like to use it as part of the local DOM within my alert banner element. And there are a couple of different ways that you could do it. You could just say pull in anything that's passed in inside. And if you do not have that select in there, it'll just take whatever you pass in as children of the element on the main page, and it'll reuse it within this element. Here, we want to be very specific about what we're pulling in. And we're saying, take anything that has the class message and use that within our alert banner element. And again, so we have the light DOM, which is, I used before. This is what refers to the normal DOM that's part of the page that is using the element. So your element itself doesn't normally know about this unless you pass things into the element via one of its content insertion points or via properties. And the reason we call it light DOM, a little confusing. It's kind of like a play on the fact that we used to refer to the DOM that Polymer maintained as the shadow DOM. So this is in contrast with the shadow DOM. We're kind of calling it the local DOM now. So there's the distinction between the light DOM, which is your page, and the local DOM, which is specific to the Polymer element. Okay, so I mentioned we could use CSS selectors here to say exactly what we want to pull in. And the way we would use it is to take that initial alert banner, and now we know that whatever is a child of that alert banner DOM element that has the class message is going to end up being inserted into our alert banner local DOM at the point that we want. And this whole using like CSS selectors to choose what gets inserted where is pretty powerful. It means you really do need to make sure everything is very well documented and you have the conventions in place and you're saying, hey, whatever you use that has the class message is going to get inserted here into this Polymer element. Whatever you use with the class blah, blah, blah is going to get inserted here. So, it's kind of up to you. You have the flexibility to define these conventions that work best. And if you're consuming any of the kind of prepackaged elements that we make available as part of our product lines, the documentation for all that will make it clear, like, hey, this is how you specify your own local content for, our standard menus or standard lists or things like that. But, in this particular case, we're using that class equals message, and, it will end up showing up with success, your first component. And last thing we want to do is kind of make this element more configurable beyond just passing in stuff that will get into the local DOM. So one of the best aspects of HTML, I think, is that you could take an element like a checkbox and you add a single attribute to it, and that ends up changing its state. So with a checkbox, you put in that checked attribute and it'll show up as checked. And this is just standard HTML and the predefined attributes for that element. So that attribute is kind of mapped to a property in JavaScript. And if you wanted to configure the element imperatively, you could do that as well if you wanted. And you want to ideally have that same power and flexibility in your own web components that you're creating or consuming. And we can do that in Polymer using some syntactic sugar. We're going to give it a properties object inside our existing definition. So this is the JavaScript portion of the Polymer element. And what we're going to do is define a property called shown. And Polymer lets us do a few things with this new property that we're defining. You give it a type, and we're going to say that it's a Boolean. And Polymer will take care of kind of deserializing it and making sure that it is actually treated as a JavaScript Boolean value. And it'll also do some nice things that you're kind of used to with HTML Booleans, for instance, where it's like, if it's present, then the property will end up being set to true. And if it's absent, then the property will end up being set to false, very much like that checked attribute that we saw on the input element. We're giving it an initial value, and we're also specifying that notify true over there, and this kind of opts us into Polymer's event dispatching and two-way binding of data. So Polymer will take care of firing a custom event that we can listen for from within the app that's consuming this element whenever that check changes. And that's if we want to. That's completely optional. For something as simple as this, where it's really just affecting the local state, you might not need to do that, but you might want to have it so, I don't know, in this particular case, when you do show an alert banner, maybe you also end up logging something and you want to listen for the alert banner being shown and tie those two things together. So you could use the custom events that Polymer offers and two-way data binding if you would like to, as a way of opting in. All right, so we have that new property defined. It's called shown, and we're going to bind attributes to the state of a property. All right, so what we're doing over here, we have this attribute called hidden. That would be an attribute on the div class, the div element that's in our local DOM. And we're using that syntax $equals over there as a way of setting the attribute on the div element directly. So that will basically be equivalent to if we were writing HTML and we're adding in an attribute hidden. And whether hidden appears or not depends on the value of that shown property that we defined elsewhere. So we're using kind of internal data binding, even if we're not taking advantage of external data binding. And we're saying whenever the shown property changes, you'll effectively toggle whether the hidden attribute is applied to the div or not. And this is a great way of controlling whether or not your element ends up being visible on the page or not. So it's going to be kind of stamped out to the page unconditionally. It's not that sometimes the alert banner element is part of your DOM and sometimes it isn't. It's always going to be part of your DOM on your page. It's just sometimes it will be shown and sometimes it won't. Cool. So somebody could use our alert banner, and by default, shown will be false because we specified that value, and you don't see anything. And then, if you add that shown attribute right over there on alert banner, it'll just show up. So that's pretty cool. And it's very much like the way native HTML elements work. The same kind of paradigms you're probably used to if you are a fan of the DOM and attributes and things like that. Cool, so that's pretty powerful. So, right, so up until now, we've been talking about how you could go and you could build your own elements if you'd like to. But the beauty of web components is that you can reuse the elements that other people have built. And when you want to add a new feature, instead of having to write it yourself, you could check, and hopefully there's an element for that. So Google, and I've been part of the team that's been working on this. I've been trying to put out kind of a few different element sets to coincide with the Polymer 1.0 release, and kind of referring to them as different product lines. And we're using, the whole kind of Polymer and chemistry thing seems to have stuck a little early on. It unfortunately makes it really hard to Google things if you've ever tried to search for Polymer, and then you're like, okay, well, let's search for Polymer elements, and there's like tons of organic chemistry results and things like that. And having okay, let's search for Polymer and iron also makes it a little tough. But we're sticking with this whole kind of chemistry related branding. So we have iron elements as one of our product lines, and this is our element sets that kind of make it easier to have the basic building blocks for any web application. A lot of non-visual things are kind of things that pipe other plumbing together if you choose to use those. We also have paper elements. A lot of folks are familiar with these. I think that many people who have heard of Polymer probably think that Polymer is just these paper elements, and this is what implements material design. So when we announced Polymer a couple years ago at Google I/O, this was a big, kind of a big component of what we were talking about, and a lot of people have conflated the two. And these paper elements are super useful. I think that they are getting good use in the Google Music web property and things like YouTube gaming. And I personally am not a fan of coming up with UIs from scratch and being able to get something that actually looks consistent, that I could kind of mix and match things together to get a UI that follows a real set of patterns and has nice animations and things like that. That's pretty powerful for me. But Polymer is not the same thing as these paper elements. You can have your UI look like whatever and still be using Polymer. So just keep that in mind. So those are two of the element product lines or element sets. But we're working on some additional ones as well, and various things in different stages of readiness, let's say. One of which is the Google Web Components, which I guess is GO. We're trying to assign random symbols. And Google has over 250 APIs that developers can use, things like Maps, Google Charts, Translate, YouTube APIs. And these services can be really powerful, but they can often be a little difficult to set up and not always designed from a web developer's perspective. So you could kind of think of the Google Web Components as an SDK for various Google APIs that are all surfaced as elements and all work together quite nicely and will behave when composed together. So if you need to work with maps or charts or YouTube, there's an element for that. Here's an example. Pretty much what I talked about before. I have been active on some of the Google YouTube elements, so if you have any questions about those in particular, happy to chat about those. But really, the idea is to take whatever is out there that would make sense to wrap in an element and to do so. There are some nice kind of lower level elements, and one that's not on the page over here, but something that kind of manages OAuth 2 flows and authenticating in a consistent fashion. So you have one element that could do that, and then you have a bunch of other elements that are all taking advantage of the fact that the user has authenticated and authorized without each of them having to know how to do that. And it uses data binding and it uses events to coordinate that, and it's pretty powerful. All right, next I'd like to talk about the Platinum elements, and this is our element line that kind of handles sort of next generation-y web features, so things like push notifications and offline caching, things that make the browser and web apps behave more like native apps. And we thought, hey, let's try to encapsulate some of those in Polymer elements and make it easier for people to start using these technologies today. So if you were to use kind of like the low-level primitives for things like service worker-based offline support, they're very powerful, but they're also very low-level, and it's kind of a very fertile ground for wrapping up within a component. So for instance, you could drop the Platinum push messaging element on your page and have a little work that you also have to do on your server, and all of a sudden you're able to kind of use push messaging and display notifications within your web app. The Platinum SW elements are kind of our wrapper around service worker caching and allow you to drop some elements on your page and define caching strategies for different types of resources, and we'll take care of the hard work of maintaining those caches and making sure that everything is available offline for your page. So pretty high level advanced functionality that's available just within a single component. Another product line is the Gold elements. These are what we're targeting as kind of like our e-commerce and making web checkout flows as simple as possible. Obviously, there are a lot of bad form designs out there, and we want to make it as easy as possible to do things like accept credit card inputs and do things like verify expiration dates, autocomplete when possible, and just take the pain out of creating web forms. So we found, and I'm not exactly sure what the source is for this study, it sounds plausible. We found that when you correctly use autocomplete on your forms, users can finish their checkout flow 30% faster. So being able to have that already wrapped up in an element is pretty nice. So as with the other product lines, we expect this set to continue to grow as we tackle all the different problems in the e-commerce space. But we're really excited, folks can start using these today, just drop them on your page and kind of take it from there. All right, so that's kind of what's shipping today. This is a really important link for folks, and again, this will all be in the slides that get sent around later. But if you wanted to go and use these yourself and see all the documentation, see the list of everything that's available, elements.polymer-project.org. Super important. It'll take you to our catalog, and the next time you want to add a feature to your app, you can say that there's an element for that. All right, so we talked about those different kind of product lines and elements that Google and some third parties have packaged up for you to reuse, but let's talk about what your options are if you're building a full application. Folks are pretty excited about web components, but they're not sure how to use them to build an entire application if you choose to use web components for that. So to help provide one opinion as to how that can be done, we've created the Polymer Starter Kit. As you might expect, it's an opinionating starting point for using Polymer 1.0. And what's included? Out of the box, you're going to get some really nice layout templates. So you don't have to think about, this is the hamburger menu pattern, this is the scrolling header pattern, things like that. You can just opt into using them if you'd like. And you could play around with them live. Got templates for doing navigation cards. We've got templates for different feeds and contact lists and kind of list view type situations. And these are all ship it kind of empty as part of the Polymer Starter Kit. You could, very low investment, just try them out, see if they're appropriate for your use case, get a feel for them. And wider card views as well. So each layout is fully responsive. That was super important for us when working on these, and I'm sure for everyone out there, that your users are going to have a wide variety of devices. Having a web app that looks good on phones, on tablets, on desktop web browsers, really important. So we're leveraging just some of the standards that are part of the material design specification. And for folks not familiar with material design, I'm sorry, I've mentioned it a couple of times already. It's kind of like Google's standard UI patterns that we're trying to apply consistently across the web and across Android apps and across some of our iOS apps, I guess. So, it's optional. You don't have to use material design, as I mentioned, with Polymer. But if you did want to opt into something and use it, it really does make things a lot easier, especially if you're not design-oriented. So you could use the breakpoints that are recommended for the different devices as part of the Polymer Starter Kit. And this is also really neat. We support app-wide theming using kind of really first-class support for CSS custom properties. And this allows you to apply a consistent theme for all the different elements within your app. So even though you might be using a dozen different paper elements to kind of stitch together a meaningful UI for your app, you could toggle the way all of them behave by changing one CSS custom property. So do things like that, switching between those colors by changing that, and you could let the user do that, or you could do it yourself. So we should also talk a little bit about the offline capabilities of the Polymer Starter Kit. So I'm really happy to say that the Polymer Starter Kit is offline first. So it comes with support for service workers already set up for you right out of the box. I've said service workers a couple of times. I'm not sure if anybody has played around with them before. I've been pretty actively involved in working on these Polymer elements for wrapping service workers. And I know that if you're using a service worker, which is this way of having kind of this background thread for the web that provides offline support via caches, and you're running it all by hand, it gets a little verbose, let's say, and doing things the right way and following common patterns are certainly possible, but can get a little boilerplatey, and there's always maybe a sinking feeling like, am I doing things really the right way, or am I accidentally, not caching things properly or not implementing a certain type of offline pattern properly. So we wanted to take the guesswork out of that and package things, and there's an element for that. So that's that Platinum Service Worker collection that I talked about previously. Again, I spent a lot of time working on these. I'm happy to chat with folks if you've been playing around with service workers, either via these elements or via any of the other libraries, kind of unrelated to Polymer. Feel free to reach out to me. And yeah, they offer really simple support for service worker caching. So you can do things like obviously you need to import the elements because we're dealing with custom elements that need to be imported, but then you just drop Platinum SW onto your page and you have these sub-elements that kind of get pulled in via the content tag that end up configuring what your caching is. And you do this all on your own page, and you can say, hey, I want to have a strategy where it goes against the network first. And if the network is not available, it's going to end up going against a previously cached copy, including if your device is like completely offline. And you can provide a list of things you want to pre-cache, all done via these standard HTML attributes. That's pretty much it. You need to have like an external kind of boilerplate file that you copy over and also deploy along with your application. But in terms of what you need to do to configure things, it's dropping it onto your page. So once you're happy with the layout and you've taken care of things like offline support and a lot of other stuff, you want to do kind of the standard steps that anybody would do before they deploy a real web application. You want to have a build process, you want to minimize and bundle your assets, you want to make sure things are as optimized as possible. And on the Polymer team, we really like gulp. I don't know if that's controversial now. It seems like there was kind of like peak gulp, and maybe we're moving in a different direction now. But if you are using the Polymer Starter Kit, though, you get a nice set of gulp tasks by default to take care of a bunch of things that many people would end up setting up anyway. So you get, set a test runner. You'll get linting, you'll get this pre-caching that we talked about, code minification, and also support browser sync. So you can use the browser sync kind of support for coordinating, previewing, and testing across multiple devices at once, and taking action on one and seeing what it looks like on the other. So, and in addition to that, live reload. This ends up being a pretty nice development stack. Again, this is optional if you already have your favorite development stack, your favorite build process. There's nothing about Polymer that requires this, but for folks who are starting from scratch and want to use something opinionated, you can do that with the Polymer Starter Kit. Cool. So if you do want to get started with Polymer Starter Kit, you can download it from that link on developers.google.com. You can search for Polymer Starter Kit in your search engine of choice if you would like that as well. All right, just about ready to wrap things up, and we will actually have some time for questions at the end. So yeah, Polymer is lean, it's production ready. We've seen it get good use within Google. We've seen it get good use outside of Google. Kind of gives you the power to create your own elements. It gives you the power to leverage elements that are part of our standard element product lines or third-party product lines that other folks have put together. And it's nice, it's really nice as part of a member of the Polymer team to see third parties kind of build an ecosystem around Polymer and people releasing their own elements, and or not even Polymer, just generic web components that can be reused. And using Polymer Starter Kit, if you like, you could get up and running, and you'll have the best practices already in place. You'll be able to have a beautiful application scaffold that's set up to work offline. And if you want to learn a little bit more about Polymer beyond what was covered in this talk, my colleague Rob Dotson is one of the few very prominent faces of Polymer. So you might have seen him before, you might have heard him. He has a really excellent video series called Polycasts. So every week he's been doing more or less kind of like live annotation, live coding of different Polymer topics, and takes questions from the audience many times too. So it's a good way to reach out as well. And upload those to our channel on YouTube. You can find it at bit.ly/polycasts. I recommend checking many of those out because it goes to a little bit more detail about the real world problems and or patterns and or tricks that you might face when you're using Polymer. And yeah, we have documentation at polymerproject.org. We have that elements.polymerproject.org that is the catalog, but polymerproject.org gives you really extensive documentation from our excellent technical writing team for all the basics that I talked about here about what web components are, but then the nitty-gritty of using Polymer, using some of the kind of syntactic sugar that you get by using the Polymer flavor of web components. And that's a great resource to check out. So yeah, I'm really excited to see what everybody builds with Polymer. Thanks again for listening, and yeah, feel free to reach out in person. I'll be here for another, I think we have the room for another 15 minutes or so. So questions from the audience are great. Grab me after. Always reach out on Twitter as well. So thanks everybody. Yeah, so just questions back there.
Thanks for the talk. That was great. So I have a question. This is probably more of a web component question than a Polymer question.
Cool.
But in terms of the interaction between a component and the parent page, I was wondering sort of both ways, like what's the power, how much can a component interact with the parent page? And then going in the other direction, how much can a parent page say, I don't want this component to be able to interact with me?
So I think in terms of the common patterns for the parent page, like consuming things that the component does, what we would recommend is that if you have control over that web component, I think custom events is probably the nicest way to do it, and to say, if the web component has, I don't know, maybe the web component handles like signing in using OAuth 2 or something like that. Have that web component then create a custom event that your parent page listens for and uses that as a signal, hey, the user is now signed in, I can do other things on my parent page, including if you're using a completely different framework, you could have behaviors that are triggered when that happens. There's also data binding, which I didn't go into too much detail for. So the parent page can specifically opt into the data binding that the Polymer library provides and have basically JavaScript variables that end up changing and being set on like a parent template, and you can react to those changes if you want. In terms of are you concerned about the elements doing things you really don't want it to do, and that's really strong protection and having a shadow DOM that nothing else can pierce or touch?
Yeah, so from a security standpoint, if you were to look at this, to me is what iframes should have been.
Yeah.
But one thing that iframes really got right is that if you're in an iframe, there's very little you can ask from from the parent, unless the parent specifically lets you. So
I really don't think that you'll get the type of security guarantees that you're probably asking about from using web components. You could, within a web component, you could just look at the global window object still, or look at the global document object. You could manipulate things. You could change anything that can be changed from JavaScript. So, this is, you're running code, and that code hopefully is trusted. You should look at what you're running before you just drop something random on the page, but it does have a lot of power for doing that. Something that's changed a little bit in Polymer between the 0.5 and the 1.0 or 1/1 dot whatever releases is around the idea of the shadow DOM and it being really unpierceable, and having things that can't leak too much in terms of styles and other things like that. And again, this is not for security guarantees, but it's more oops, I accidentally am running, document query selector all or whatever, and I end up picking up things that are part of my elements local DOM when I didn't expect that. And we've kind of relaxed that a little bit in the protections that you get in Polymer 1x, partly because we've seen that people don't run into it too often as a problem. And we're calling if you are in a browser that natively implements the shadow DOM, you will kind of get some of those guarantees around your own DOM not leaking into the page. But we've found that if you try to polyfill the shadow DOM, you end up getting some performance hits, and we ended up wanting to kind of optimize for performance with the ability to opt into a really precise, technically correct implementation of a shadow DOM polyfill if you want, but by default you kind of have a little less technically correct, but much faster implementation in Polymer 1x. So there is a little bit more spillover and not as quite a tight divide between the elements DOM and your own DOM, unless you explicitly opt into it in Polymer 1x. And again, it ended up being a reasonable trade-off in our view. That really solves the security concern, though. You really should be careful about dropping any random third-party element on your page, because it does have a lot of power. So don't look at the code or consume one of the ones that we publish. I feel pretty confident that there's nothing too awful going in there. But you can even, in those cases, look at the code too.
That's helpful. Thanks.
Awesome.
What's the big difference between what Polymer is doing and what like Angular 2 is doing with their with their components and stuff there?
So I'm not super familiar with whether Angular 2 is producing things that are technically web components. You're shaking your head yes, so maybe they are. I think that what we've been trying to do on the Polymer team is to make sure that what we produce follows the specification for what a web component should be and is generic enough that it could then be consumed from places like Angular, React, Ember, anything that works with the DOM already. I'm not sure if that's, I unfortunately, even though Angular is a Google product, I know a lot less about it than I do about Polymer, so I'm not positive whether that was the goal of the Angular team, where they wanted to let you be able to produce reusable, technically correct web components that could be dropped into, an Ember act. Seems probably not. I assume it'd be a little weird using Angular to write something that you then drop into React, or maybe it is. I don't know. But that's basically the distinction, and that's what the goal of Polymer is.
Is there any kind of an inheritance model in web components or Polymer that would let you extend a web component?
So, you know what? There are kind of like mix-ins if you are writing your own component, and that's kind of the model that we're pushing people towards and we're using in our own components, where you have common behaviors that are then kind of applied, and we have a specific syntax, which is definitely a lot more advanced than what I wanted to cover in the slides for doing that. In terms of taking a native HTML element and creating like a version that officially extends it, this is something I'm not super familiar on with what our current recommendations are, because I know at a certain point you were able to kind of like put an is tag as part of the template for a Polymer element and say like this is an input, but it's a special type of input, and treat it more or less the same as you would any input and inherit all those kind of like the way a browser knows how to deal with the input. And I know that was something that was around for a while. I'm honestly, unfortunately, not sure whether we're still recommending that folks go that route, and it might have been like one of those proposals that was part of like the HTML spec that never actually panned out. But if you are finding yourself with certain behaviors that are repeated again and again, and you're writing your own Polymer elements, we're kind of pointing people towards using mix-in patterns, basically. Yeah. Cool. Any other folks? Yeah. Hi.
Thanks for your talk. So my question is specifically around the 0.5 to 1.0 transition, and I was just wondering why you stopped doing data binding on top of object observe.
Because object observe has kind of just gone away in general. It's been deprecated in Chrome.
Because I thought they made
browsers.
the decision to get rid of it from the spec once Polymer decided to drop it.
Yeah, I mean, I think Polymer was definitely the most notable user of the implementation of Object Observe that made it into Chrome, and I'm not sure which other browsers have made it into. And it gets a little bit more technical than I'm familiar with in terms of what the objections were to the Object Observe specification. and I actually kind of liked it. Like I played around with it a little bit. And I think the idea is that we're moving to just a different model that's a little bit more widely supported for observing changes to the properties. I don't think it looked like other browsers were going to implement Object Observe, and seemed like kind of a dead end from a specification point of view. So, we could polyfill it, and there was a polyfill for Object Observe that shipped as part of Polymer 05, but it was also a question of performance and just doing things that were technically correct as part of the Object Observe spec but weren't natively implemented in other browsers really didn't lead to the type of performance that we could get from using something that kind of put that to the side. So yeah, I'm sure there's a public discussion list where people were debating whether Object Observe was going to ever actually make it into an official specification that got accepted widely by browsers, and that backstory I think was done in the public, so you could probably look it up and get a more authoritative answer as to why.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So a lot of times when you're working with CSS and JavaScript and you're doing like web layer performance, you're playing like the roll-up game to figure out at what level it makes sense to roll things together, right?
Yep.
Do you lose that completely with web components, or how does the performance optimization work?
There's some patterns around when you end up doing your imports and structuring things so that you lazy load when necessary. And some of that kind of runs counter, and then this is not specific to Polymer, but some of that runs counter to like bundling everything up into one huge import that you kind of import up front. And yeah, I think that a lot of the same patterns that people are exploring for just any type of web development apply equally to Polymer in terms of when things get loaded and getting things that are above the fold on the page as quickly as possible. And some of those patterns are kind of evolving when they're specific to Polymer. I think that like Eric Beitelman in particular in the team has been doing a lot of exploration around that. I'm working right now with him and a few other folks on the 2016 incarnation of our Google I/O web app, which is kind of like our showcase of Polymer, in addition to being a nice conference, web app experience. So I know that I have to review after this some code that he's written for kind of restructuring when things are loaded and doing some more late loading. So yeah, I don't think it's the sort of thing where there's one recipe that will give you the absolute peak performance that we're shipping like as part of Polymer Starter Kit right now. I think Polymer Starter Kit is a little bit more focused on making sure the general tooling and the layouts are there, and still doing some older things like bundling everything together. But maybe when it's time for Google I/O, we'll have some more stuff to announce and kind of some things that you could opt into a little bit easier to make sure that those things are loaded in order and having more control over what gets loaded when. So yeah, stay tuned, I guess. Is there a question there too? Or? Cool.
I was just wondering if there are any particular concerns with like isomorphic applications and server-side rendering.
Yeah, yes, there are. It's the sort of thing where you cannot do the same sort of approach that you might use with Universal React right now very easily in Polymer. We would like to make it easier to do that, and some of that involves figuring out how to take the very specific web component JavaScript and run that in a server environment with a virtual DOM. I know that there are actively a number of people on the team looking into the best patterns for that. We don't really have anything right now that we're ready to release, but again, another stay tuned. We're a couple of months, we're a month and a half away from the Google I/O conference, and I would expect there to be a number of announcements just about kind of like what's happened in the past 6 months in web tooling and how it applies to Polymer. Probably there. That being said, like if you're using Polymer and you're not doing anything too crazy in terms of manipulating the DOM as part of your initial setup, then you can just treat it as, yeah, it just passed through. But it's more like, you know, that implies that you know exactly what all of the Polymer elements are doing right now.
To get data or whatever as part of these components, then it needs to run everything.
Yes, it does right now. So we're trying to make that simpler and more doable. So, all right, we might be running into the next session. So feel free to grab me afterwards. And thanks everybody for coming.